Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. At a biblical perspective, wide-ranging, apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography,
Hi, this is Kirby
sexual
Anderson.
ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday we talked about the Republican presidential debate, and of course this Saturday is the Democratic presidential debate. And one of the phrases you might hear, and even if you don't hear the phrase, certainly are going to be people appealing to this idea of social justice. We hear about this quite often, and it is used to justify almost every liberal progressive program. It sometimes is used by religious figures as well, whether it's a pope and an encyclical, or whether it's various Protestant leaders in mainline churches. It certainly has had a very significant familiarity and even enthusiastic embrace by those on the university campuses. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today in this first hour talking about this idea of social justice, because there's a new book out called Social Justice. It isn't what you think it is. Now, it sounds a little bit like a line out of Princess Bride. That isn't, the word is what you think it is. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about this phrase that I think has been misused and manipulated in ways that we really need to understand. So we're going to be talking with Michael Novak. I remember I crossed paths with him, it goes back 35 years through Ernest Lefevre and the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Since that time, I've done whole weeks of radio programs on the Probe radio program on Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, On Two Wings, Washington's God, just to mention a few of the books that he has done. If you're not familiar with him, for 32 years he was the chairman of the Religion and Public Policy situation there at the American Enterprise Institute, and now is a visiting professor at the Ave Maria University in Florida. Back in 1994, he was the recipient of the Templeton Award and actually has served as an ambassador under President Ronald Reagan. Michael Novak, welcome to Point of View.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Kerby. Good to be with you again.
One of the things I'd love to see if we can try to educate people on is social justice. And in the book that you co-authored with Paul Adams, you really take on a couple of different issues, because there's some people that believe it's a mirage. Others have used it. But I would have to say, before I get into this in a lot of detail, this is a term that's so vague that I think lots of people use it to justify their particular policies, their particular statements, even some of their laws based upon this idea of social justice. And I think it's almost intended to be somewhat of a vague term so people can use it any way they want.
Well, that isn't the way it started, but you're right. It's a great claim, isn't it? I'm just, you're unjust. I'm for social justice, you're for social injustice. I mean, it's unbelievably powerful. And of course, as far as I can see, the first uses of it are in Catholic social thinking in the 1840s. And it finally got to the ear of Pope Leo XIII in 1891, who in an encyclical on the New Times pointed out that all Europe, and of course behind it the rest of the world, was changing since the gospel times, since the Old Testament. Most people had lived on farms, in agriculture, where the family worked together in the fields and everywhere. And but now millions were moving to the cities, not yet big and industrial, but getting there. And they no longer worked on the land, and they no longer worked together. It had severe consequences for the family. And the Pope pointed out that when the family starts to lose its significance, so does Christianity. The best teacher down through history of Christianity has been the family. God, your Father. What does it mean that God the Father loves us if our Father on earth has abandoned me as a young child, left, had my mother pregnant and left. He didn't love me. He didn't give any sign of loving me. Why didn't he stay? Why didn't he help? And so one loses one's sense of God the Father, and so on. So he thought, popes don't usually have anything to say about the economy, but in this new time, with the destruction of the family, we really have to speak up. And then the second thing behind it was the immense growth of the state. Socialist, communist systems are beginning to grow. The ideas are beginning to spread. There's no communist revolution yet, not for another 25 years. But he sees it coming, and he's dead against it. Because what they aim to do, these systems, is reduce everybody to equality, and that's inhuman. God did not make people equal. He made them each one to be loved, each one to be cherished, but they have different talents. They have different energies. They have different ambitions. God's not an egalitarian, but he does believe in treating everybody fair. Well, anyway, I don't want to go on, but you get the drift that he was scared to death of one uniform state with all the power, ending private property, and thus all the capacity of the church to print Bibles, to run schools, to spread the gospel, and get its message out. And so he was looking for a means of social action. People needed more activity together to better things, but without turning to the state. And that's why he called for the growth of this new virtue. And slowly it began to be codified as social justice, but it meant an alternative to the state. He has some wonderful passages on page 98 to 102 of our book.
Right.
Paul and I describe some of the great criticism he gave. 13 reasons why socialism was bound to fail, was futile, and was evil. In Central Europe, 1989, I had occasion to be over there and talk to a number of people in Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, and so on. And they were going through these. You say, by God, every one of them is exactly true. It's exactly what happened. This 1891, when a lot of intellectuals in Europe were praising the coming of socialism as the coming of a new age, and I've seen the future and it is ours. Bizarre stuff. And he has about 5 arguments against the idea of equality. I've recited some of them. People are not equal. It's not fair to treat people as though they're equal. Some need more help. Some need more room to move. They're ambitious and they're creative and they're inventive. And you need to have a society that takes advantage of that. That's a great human resource. It's the main cause of the wealth of nations. And to oppress that is to oppress everybody. So anyway, he laid out quite a theory, and it's been misinterpreted and misused, as you were saying, Kerby, exactly as you were saying. So our attempt is to clear the air and give a succinct definition of social justice, which almost all the authors on the subject have been avoiding for 100 years.
That's right.
You can read lots of books on social justice. They don't give a definition. We do.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Michael Novak. Again, going all the way back to Pope Leo in 1891, and then also Pope Pius later on in 1931. You have this idea of I can talk about some of those principles, and if you're taking some notes, we'll try to cover them fairly quickly. The 5 C's, the 5 R's, and the 6 S's that really help you understand what this is. This term has been hijacked, it's been misused, and it's good to go back to the original and also recognize that how sometimes it's used to manipulate political discussion. So we're privileged to have with us today one of the co-authors of this book. Are the authors. We have information about them on our website, and of course you can perhaps find the book in your local bookstore. It's published by Encounter. We'll talk more with Michael Novak right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How can we stop ISIS? That is a question many are asking, so it's worth sharing a plan that makes sense.
Former CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin has written in the past about the scourge of ISIS. Today I want to explain his latest plan using military strategy. He is quick to explain that there is no military solution to the problem of radical Islam, but he also adds that it is impossible to talk about ending ISIS without a military component. The major task is figuring out how to implement these ideas. Here are 5 important steps. First, establish clear priorities. Too often the U.S. government has tried to do many things at once, degrading ISIS while also weakening the Assad regime. He says that the catch-22 is that weakening one strengthens the other. Therefore, it is time to say that destroying ISIS comes first. Second, we need to provide better arms for those fighting ISIS. This would certainly include providing arms for the Kurds in Syria. They have demonstrated the will and the capability to defeat ISIS. Third, intensify the U.S. response. We should intensify the air campaign and increase the number of U.S. special operators in the theater well beyond the 50 sent by the president. Fourth, we should establish safe enclaves within Syria for fighters and refugees. This could be manned partly by U.S. advisors and also a warning to Assad that violating the space would risk destroying his air force. Fifth, lead in the formation of a substantial multinational force. This force could be capable of destroying ISIS, and this is a significant leadership challenge, but it must be done successfully. ISIS can be defeated militarily, but this must include a coalition of other forces. Ending ISIS requires leadership and a concerted military response. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
This Christmas, bring home and share the gift of War Room on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD, available in stores December 22nd.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Michael Novak, one of the co-authors of the book Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is. And oftentimes we run into individuals talking about social justice. Perhaps you have some young people coming back from college talking about it and say, you know, it may not necessarily mean what you think it means. And this is why I think this book is so significant. About 300 pages, published by Encounter. We have a number of ways in which you can benefit from this. First of all, we have posted one of the articles about the book by Sherilyn LeBon called What is Social Justice, Not What You Think It Is. And so that article is available on our website, and we have a link for you if you would want to get a copy of the book, or perhaps you can find it in your local bookstore. So lots of resources that we wanted to make available to you as we talk about this issue of social justice. But let's, if we can, Michael Novak, for just a few minutes, talk about some of the principles that are kind of underlying that. And I mentioned that you have the 5 C's, and then the 5 R's are really the different rights, like a right of private property and association and the rest. What does social justice, or what should it mean, so that we can begin to see how it's been perverted?
Hey, listen, I just listened to your little point of view about how to defeat ISIS, if I may. Kerby, you have a really great gift for concision. I wish I did as well, and as briefly and succinctly. So I'm going to try. But I'm going to need your help in naming these.
Sure, that's fine. But
I don't have the book right in front of me.
That's neither here nor there. I was going to get into the issue of wealth, for example, the cause of wealth and creativity. You've talked about that before in the spirit of democratic capitalism. Then you have things like the right of private property. Even in the 19th century, some of the ideas of Adam Smith certainly were part of this idea of social justice, and that is very different than, say, Karl Marx or the communist idea, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very. Let me go through them just a little bit. First, I want to say, because you did mention how to buy the book, I learned from Peggy Noonan's recent book and her comments on it. You'll be happier if you get this book, because at last you'll begin to understand what you hear with your ears all the time.
Yes.
Your mind will begin to grasp it. Second, give it to your pastor. It's for Christmas. It'd be a great gift for a pastor for Christmas because they face the term all the time. Okay, forgive me for that, but if we go through the, let me come to the definition of social justice.
Good.
Paul Adams, my co-author, emeritus, retired, has worked in the field of social work for some 50 years, English by birth, worked all over the United States and Hawaii. And what he noticed is an odd contradiction that social workers always talk about social justice, but they don't define it. He's thinking even of himself. And if you search books on social justice, you can't find the definition. So he heard I was working on something on this, and he had been wrestling with it for 30 years. And so he took a class of mine on the theme down at Ave Maria University in Florida. And he encouraged me to put it in shape for a book because it met the needs of people in social work. What I was describing in theory is what social work has learned in practice, he said. Namely, that you don't really help the poor if you do everything for them, because when you withdraw, you leave them exactly where they were. They don't know what to do.
Right.
He said the key to social work is to empower people, to teach them habits, especially habits of association, how to work together with others to solve their common problems, how to get together in the public housing unit, and to get government control ceded to the residents, and then clean out the place, get rid of the drug dealers, vote and work together to do this, and work to keep it clean in the hallways and together, set some rules and police them yourselves without turning to government. Okay, so Paul notices this best practices of social work are empowering people to learn how to be social animals and political animals and get it done yourself, together, a group of you together. And this is how we end up defining social justice. It's an individual, it's a habit rooted in the individual, a habit or a disposition, customary thing you do, but it's a special habit. It's rooted in the individual, but it helps the individuals to be social animals and political animals, to learn the habits of association, how to form committees and little organizations of people in your parish, your housing unit, your neighborhood, to get things done, to make the neighborhood, the parish, the housing, public housing unit a better, more habitable, more human place. So it's social in two senses. You're working together with others, and then you're doing something for the common good in the local area, or it could be in the state area. It could be internationally, like the Red Cross, or like these organizations which gather capital from people who have been successful in little packages to make microloans in the third world, to get millions of small businesses started all over the third world. Because the best hope of the poor in the coming 20 years, and our duty in the next 20 years, is to lift everybody out of poverty, which can be done. The Lord made the earth filled with resources, filled with wealth, but humans have to have the wit and the technique to uncover them. And so the only hope of the poor does not come from the state. It comes from the formation of millions of small businesses employing 3, 4, 10 people, whatever, and therefore giving jobs to an entire population, most of whom who are not working now. They're there, but they're not working. And to give them the techniques about what to do and how to do it. And you need small funds for this, just micro funds. $1,000, $2,000 loan can change a whole village in Bangladesh or somewhere. If you give people the fertilizer and show them how to use it for vegetables or for flowers, which they can gather and sell in the cities, and make themselves not only self-supporting but prosperous. It's happening all over the world, and there are a lot of Christian churches and others who are gathering together to get involved in these overseas micro-capital funds to really empower the poor, to move out of poverty. So that's what social virtue is, social justice is. It's a virtue, a habit which individuals learn, which empowers them to act together with others and to become a force that improves their neighborhood, their village, their state, their country, and maybe the whole world.
Robert Bellah talked about this idea of habits of the heart, and you addressed that in the book. And, of course, Edmund Burke talked about little platoons, because sometimes you're not talking about massive government programs.
Not at all. Not at all.
Go ahead.
And that's what social justice is there to stimulate. Robert Bellah was a teacher of mine at Harvard, and I loved it. Tocqueville and Democracy in America said that the first law of democracy is the habit of association. And Americans do that, he said, better than anybody in the world. There aren't 10 people in all of France who can form associations the way Americans do routinely. Out on the frontier, how did they spend it? They talked about the individual, but what they really did was community. They gathered, they helped one another put up the barn for Smiths, and put up the barn for Costellos, and put up the barns for Grimm's, and sometimes the homes. And then if they needed a bridge, they pitched in together to build the bridge. If they wanted a school, they had to build it, like in the play Oklahoma. If they wanted a church, there was no church from the 11th century or the 16th century waiting for them. They had to build it themselves. And so the Americans are really communitarians at heart.
Yes.
We've been practicing social justice out of necessity from the very beginning, improving the common good together. That's what social justice is.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Michael Novak. The book is entitled Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is. It's published by Encounter, and as again, he suggested, might want to give it to your pastor, give it to maybe some young people coming back from the university who've been reading John Rawls or something else, and maybe need to think through this a little bit more. But just before we go to a break, let me encourage you to take a minute right now and make a gift to Point of View. Your gift to Point of View will change lives, and those lives will help change the nation. And we have so many different stories that we've told, but certainly one of the people that we like to tell the story of will join me tomorrow in our roundtable, Kelly Shackelford. We'll have Kelly Shackelford, we'll have Penna Dexter, and our Colonel Alan West will be with us. But Kelly Shackelford started listening to Point of View when he was in law school, and he was listening at night to this program and said, this is something maybe I should do to start defending religious liberty in the courts. And so part of the reason he's doing what he's doing today is because he listened to Point of View. Kelly's life really was changed because someone like you gave to Point of View. And so as a result, we really are asking you to help change a life today with your gift to Point of View. The life you change through your gift will change the nation, and that's why we have a button on our website that says Changing Lives, Changing the Nation. We have lots of stories that we'll tell, and over the next 2 hours today, I'll try to tell some of those stories, but it's a good illustration of why you need to, as we go to a break right now, go to the website, click on that button that says Changing Lives, Changing the Nation. Donate now, and your generous gift will help us continue that ministry and opportunity, and give you an opportunity to continue to hear from Michael Novak, which we'll do right after these important messages.
Basketball is a team game, but when a player steps to the free throw line with 1 second remaining in a tie game, it comes down to one player with one ball and one goal. Put that shot through the hoop and carry the entire team to victory. Point of View is staring down the final seconds of 2015, and though we could focus on the negative things that happened, there were so many good things this year as well. Years ago, a 19-year-old woman started listening to Point of View. It educated her, it inspired her, and Michelle Bachmann went on to a notable career in the U.S. Congress. We could tell so many stories of those who are changing their community and changing the nation thanks to the work of Point of View and thanks to you who give. I'm handing you the ball for that final shot. Make it count. If you're concerned about America, invest in Point of View. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net or give using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Michael Novak, the co-author of the book Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is. Mentioned some of his previous books, and of course you can see that on our website. Things like The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, On Two Wings, and Washington's God, just to mention a few that I've certainly quoted from and used on this program. But let's, if we can, maybe for just a few minutes, Michael, talk about the differences between, say, capitalism and socialism. When we look at the younger generation, which we really want our radio program to reach more and more, we recognize that one of the Pew surveys show that about a third of them believe that capitalism is better than socialism. A third of them believe socialism is better than capitalism, and another third really haven't made up their minds, which tells me that there are a lot of individuals out there graduating from college or even heading off to college that are convinced socialism's a good idea. And yet in your book, you say that the root of evil in socialism is forced equality. So we have this competing vision between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. How do we think about that in terms of this idea of social justice?
Well, what I mean by capitalism, and I do recommend, if we're going to lift the poor out of poverty, in fact, and not just talk about it, I mean, the goal of the sympathy for the poor, compassion for the poor, help for the poor, is to help them get out of poverty. And if we want to get everybody out of poverty in the next generation, we've got half of those out of poverty in the last 20 years, and we can do the second half promptly and directly if we learn the lessons. What I mean by capitalism is the spirit of invention and discovery and creativity in every human being, made in the image of God, made in the image of the Creator. And not everybody is equally skillful in building a small business, but a lot of people are. There are, millions of people around the globe who make their living in small businesses, either because they founded it and own it, or because they work for a small business. Think of the barbers in a barber shop, or helpers in a grocery store, whatever image you want to summon up. It's people of invention and creativity who build a small community of helpers, who work together, who associate together to bring a good product and good service to their neighbors so that the neighbors form loyalty with them and come back. That's what I mean by capitalism, is the spirit of enterprise, the spirit of creativity, rooted in individuals, but then working with others. You can only do it with others. And under the law, you have to have a system of law behind it. Otherwise, it won't work. And you have to do it, how can I put this? You can't make an idol of money or business. The point of view of the business is to serve your neighbors, to bring them goods and services they wouldn't otherwise have, and to do it well and better and more friendly manner than any other business. And I don't understand how people don't see that. If I think back on my own history, my family came from Central Europe, from Slovakia, in the hills, poor agricultural people, literate, but otherwise not terribly skilled, and came to Pennsylvania, in coal mining and steel country, and had to learn sophisticated work pretty quick, but also learned that they were no longer subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were citizens. They were the ones who were the sovereigns of the country. And they hired political people to work for them in the Congress or wherever to serve them. But the sovereigns were the people, and takes a whole new way of thinking. They had to adjust to being an American. Well, that's the story of the country, and it's amazing. It's an amazing story, both in politics and in economics. And it's why so many of us, my grandparents came to this country. I'm just third generation. And or second generation, depending on how you count them. And yet we're no longer a poor family. All my brothers and sisters have been through college. We've all done well in what we do, not wealthy, but done well and done our best in everything, as we were taught to do. And everybody I know is like that. one thing I think I persuaded, but I worked through others to persuade Pope Francis not to say the poor always get poorer. That didn't happen in my family. The poor got richer, and by God, it can happen to other families. And it's happened to millions of families around the world. And it can happen to millions more. If you look at China and India, how many people have been moved out of poverty there? It's about 500 million.
Yes.
Just in 20-some years. I mean, and if people are in favor of socialism, a third of students are in favor of socialism, just show us some socialist countries where it works.
Yeah, that's right.
Just show us some anywhere.
Yeah, we're willing to be educated, but we haven't seen that. You mentioned families, and one of the chapters in your book that you and Paul Adams wrote was about marriage as a social justice issue. And when you talk about families, intact families are better for children. And there's a lower suicide rate, and there's a lower problem of those getting involved in gangs and drugs and other things. So it seems to me that another very important component, if you want to raise people out of poverty, is to have strong families, don't you think?
Oh, you don't have to believe this for Christian reasons or Jewish reasons or for moral reasons. Just look at the practicalities of it. The number of children born out of wedlock is getting extremely high in this country, and almost as high for whites as it was for blacks. Remember when Senator Moynihan back in the 60s just pointed out what was a fact, the extraordinary number, 15% of black children were being born out of wedlock. That means discipline their sons, no fathers to help their sons get jobs, no fathers to teach their sons how to hold jobs. Well, it's now spread through the white population, even in rural areas. The number of people living on welfare and not marrying is staggering. About 30% of our children, and in a city like Washington, D.C., about 70% of the children are living without a father in the home, brought up just by their mother, the heroines who really do heroic work to keep these children in manners and educated and prepared for life. Low birth weight, the number of women who are abandoned by the men, who don't have good prenatal care, and whose children are born low birth weight, which tends to mean brain problems and other problems of development in greater numbers. The proclivity to lack of discipline, to crime rates going up, white and black, among such poor families, it is just so much higher. The number who finish school is so much lower. The number of those who get incarcerated over a lifetime is so vastly much higher. And so, in every social indication, they are penalized. And it's not the feminization of poverty we're seeing. It's the masculinization of irresponsibility.
Yes.
Of fathers abandoning those they have fathered. It's just horrible, and it's never happened in history before. So it's just brutal punishment for those they leave behind. And that's what makes it a social justice issue.
Again, one of the chapters in the book is Marriage as a Social Justice Issue. And again, this is a book of about 300 pages with, we've only covered some of it. We'll get back after our next break to talk about that. But let me also mention that we, in addition to having this article about social justice, that is one that you can find, and information about the book. We also have a link to Michael Novak's website. It's michaelnovak.net. And some of his most recent articles posted there, What Will Pope Francis Say, and St. Francis Here in America, as well as why they hate pro-lifers so much, a number of other articles and resources. So again, you can find that at the website pointofview.net. And if you'd like to join the conversation today, this is probably much one where you kind of sit back and just listen. But if you have some comments you'd like to make, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll probably take some other calls in the second hour, but wanted to really address some of those issues that are very important if we indeed want to raise raise this next generation out of poverty, and we've seen the success on this program as we've talked with other experts as well. It has been due in large part to an emphasis upon such things as capitalism, private property rights, even if you don't own land, but certainly have an opportunity to exchange goods and resources in a fair economy, and certainly the use of entrepreneurial activity, and what, of course, in one of his books, Michael Novak calls the spirit of democratic capitalism. So we're going to come back and talk just another few minutes about this idea of social justice. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You can also, of course, go to our website, pointofview.net, and you will see that we have posted some articles that you will probably find very helpful. One which in particular deals with this issue of social justice and is a bit of a summary of the book by Sherilyn Laban, What is Social Justice? Not What You Think It Is. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Michael Novak for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is. And again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Mordecai in New Mexico, what would you like to ask?
Well, I don't really so much have a question. I just wanted to thank Michael Novak for all the years that he seemed like a lone voice on CNN that gave us conservatives something to be really thankful for, and he was a bright and morning star for on that program. So
Yeah, I think you might be thinking about Robert Novak, but again, I think it's
Hey,
valuable.
we're cousins.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we called each other cousins, and
Yes.
we weren't literally, but we were quite sympathetic.
That's right, for sure.
My cousin, we used to say.
Yes. Well, and we have talked about Robert Novak as well. So again, appreciate his defense over the years of some of the very same things you've been writing about. And just before we run out of time, I wanted to talk about this issue of charity. You have some chapters in here about charity. And of course, Arthur Brooks has been on this program. Of course, you know him as well. He wrote the book years ago, Who Really Cares? The Surprising Truth About Compassionate Conservatism. Oftentimes, as he has pointed out, liberals talk about giving and conservatives actually give. Secularists talk about being concerned about the poor, and people with Christian convictions actually do something about it. But what about this idea of charity? How does that relate to social justice?
Well, charity, caritas, I really like the Latin word from the Greek because it gets at the pure. It's a little bit different from the modern idea of charity. Charity means, giving to the Salvation Army, giving to the poor, like that, and that's beautiful and that's good. But the caritas, that word for it is stronger, and it means the distinctive love which only God shares. There are 9 or 10 different kinds of love in the history of Christian thought. Agape, or I'm not going to go through them. That's a different lecture.
Sure.
But it's a wonderful lecture. And but caritas is a special kind of love that only God has. And it's the love which is outward going, which results in the generation of the Son and of the Holy Trinity, and results from that in the creation of the whole universe. God wants to create a world in which somewhere at least one creature, male and female, he created them, who are capable of recognizing his gift, his offer of friendship, and saying yes or no to it. He doesn't want the worship of slaves. He wants the worship of free women and free men. So he offers his friendship, but everyone has a chance to say yes or no. And that offer is inalienable. Your mom can't answer it for you. Your dad can't answer it for you. Your cousins can't do it. You got to do it. You got to say yes or no to the Lord. You have to make that confession one way or the other. And that's the root, deep force of Christianity, trying to spread the love of God, the caritas of God throughout the whole world. And those who say yes, the Lord sends his caritas to infuse them, to teach us how to love even our enemies. Now, I got some critics and foes who beat up on me and so forth. They're not enemies, really, but still, sometimes I know from faith that God loves them, and God made them, and God has this distinctive image of himself in them. I look hard to find what it is that God loves in them. Sometimes I have a hard time finding it. We're not commanded to like them. We're commanded to love them with God's own love. And so, that's the fire that infuses the whole world. And spreading that in certain areas is the work of social justice. It's what leads us to have a sense of solidarity with all the poor of the world, and a sense of subsidiarity that the best way to help them is to work with institutions closest to them, their neighbors, their friends, their local community, and let's work through that instead of through the state, and so on. The panoply of 16 different things the human race has learned about how to best live a humanistic life together in a political and a social way. And, that's the whole background. So charity is the whole wellspring, the whole dynamism of it all.
Well, again, if you take the numbers that the Heritage Foundation's come up with, that since the war of poverty was announced, we've spent $22 trillion. And given the fact that we're $18 trillion in debt, you can see where a lot of that money went. And in some respects, we haven't made the kind of impact on poverty that was dreamed of by President Lyndon Johnson and others. Maybe there's a better model, and I think it's exactly the biblical model, and it's the one that you talk about in the book in terms of charity. This book, Social Justice. So I do want to thank you for writing the book and giving us an hour today. And I did mention your website. If people wanted to follow up and find out a little bit more, it's michaelnovak.net. Some of your articles are there, some of your other books, and a way in which people can follow you. True?
Yeah, we'll post later today an article which just appeared in Crisis Magazine online, a review of the book by James Shaw, retired professor from Georgetown. Just an amazing review.
He was one of my professors, by the way, when I was at Georgetown.
Yeah, I wondered about that when I saw you got a degree from Georgetown. Well, you had the best. Well, you know how great he is.
Well, I had Gene Kirkpatrick, and I had George Carey, and I had James Shaw, so I had a pretty good group.
Well, you had the best.
And I had you, because I had a chance to learn from you as well.
You had the best. Anyway, it's such a good review, and it's so analytical. It makes me think about things I wish I'd said more of. It's a good review, so we'll post that on the website.
Okay, well, then people can find that in just a few hours. And again, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
It was really great of you to have me, and I deeply appreciate it.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll give you a chance to join our conversation if you'd like. And I just might mention that another book that I just sort of mentioned in passing is one by Arthur Brooks. And at that time, when he wrote the book about Who Really Cares, he was actually a professor at Syracuse. Now, of course, he's at the American Enterprise Institute, which is where, of course, Michael Novak served for 32 years. He's now at Ave Maria University down there in Ave Maria, Florida. But he did, I think, a very good service by reminding us that oftentimes liberals talk about giving, but it's the conservatives that really give. Secularists talk about the need for compassion for the poor, but it's really the religious people that are the difference. And he's pointed out that in terms of giving, there is a remarkable charity gap between those who talk about it and those who actually do something. Is enormous. And interestingly enough, it's just not that they were giving more to churches and charitable organizations. They even concluded that if liberals were to give blood at the same level that conservatives did, we wouldn't have a blood shortage in America. So on all sorts of issues, whether it's giving your time, your treasure, your talent, even your blood, there is a very significant charity gap. And it's important to remember when you have people talking about social justice. And so just one of those issues, one to put on the table. And I think you probably would enjoy this conversation with Michael Novak. If you hear the phrase social justice and you want to know what it really means, understand some of the key principles, this would be a great book for you to get. And of course, we've suggested maybe you want to give it to a pastor or give it to a young person that's come back from college filled with all sorts of strange ideas that they've picked up at the university. This would be a good antidote to that. But just before we go to break, let me again encourage you to take a moment right now to make a gift a Point of View. If you appreciate these kinds of conversations, we certainly do welcome your involvement with us. And certainly what you can do right now is to help us and help you to directly make a difference, because again, Point of View is in the business of changing lives, and we believe that will change the nation. We have all sorts of stories. One, of course, that I've told before about Lee Weaver. He and his family started a crisis pregnancy center. Now they call them pregnancy resource centers. I went to their banquet this year to speak, and what an incredible amount of impact that they are having. Thousands of babies have been saved through these various pregnancy centers. And again, one more example of a changed life that's changing the culture and changing the community and changing the nation. So please take the time right now to visit our website, pointofview.net. Please help change a life today with your gift of Point of View. You can actually change lives with your gift, and we encourage you to do so. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You listen to this program any length of time, you might remember some interviews we've done in the past with Dr. Curt Thompson. We talked about his first book, Anatomy of the Soul. He is a psychiatrist in private practice in Falls Church, Virginia, and also the founder of an organization of the Center for Being Known, has his MD from Wright State University, and as an individual has really been addressing some of the issues of the soul, but now has this new book out called The Soul of Shame. Really takes some of the material that we've talked about in the previous interview and unpacks this idea of shame and the impact that it's having on our lives and our souls. So again, this will be a topic that I think will be very practical. And as we go into this conversation, perhaps you'll want to join the conversation at 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Thompson, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Let me just for a minute, for people that aren't familiar, talk about your previous book, The Anatomy of the Soul, because you really pulled a lot of that together. And you know as well as I do, probably better than all of us, that when you go to medical school, you really sort of look at the physical, and you're not in the business of dealing with the spiritual, psychological, supernatural that much. But then, of course, when you go to psychiatry, then you start talking at least understand that there is a soul and that neurobiology and all sorts of medical practices illustrate that what the Bible has been saying for centuries and millennia is actually true.
Right. I mean, I think you've said it really well. I reflect on the very foundational texts of the creation narrative, where in the second chapter of Genesis, in the 7th verse, the writer proclaims that the Lord God breathed the breath of life into man, man became a living being, that he formed the man out of the dust of the earth. But he wasn't fully formed until the breath of God was breathed into him, and that in many respects we are dirt and we are breath. And if you take either one of those away, we cease to have an existence and a meaning. And that dirt, to me, really represents all of our physicality and all that that means, and that breath really represents all of the deeply sensed relationality, even those parts that are mysterious and that we don't have any technologies for measuring, things that exist and are true and that we really believe are really real, but that somehow are still outside our capacity for measuring with all of our scientific mind. I think that in the work of Anatomy of the Soul, one thing that I attempted to do was to invite the reader to imagine that all of life is spiritual in this sense, that there's no part of the world over which Jesus is not Lord and King, and that what we do with our bodies is as important as what we do with our relationships, and you can't separate those things. And so it is as spiritual to have a conversation or to develop good software as it is to pray. And the place where so many of these things converge is in that space that we call the mind. And the biblical narrative, I think, though it is not a book of neuroscience, reflects and is reflected in a lot of this data that has been emerging, especially over the last probably 10 to 15 years, that is captured in this field that we call interpersonal neurobiology. And that is a field that attempts to really look at multiple different domains of science that all come together, that have something in common with trying to understand what the nature of the mind is and how it functions. When we consider that science in the light of the biblical narrative, we see that the science itself reflects the very things that we've been reading about and been taught for over 5,000 years in the creation texts, the things that we read about in the history of God's activity with a certain people, the work that is required in one to wrestle with God that we read about in the Psalms, and then, of course, the advent of our Lord Jesus, who is God coming in human, more human than we could ever be apart from God's intervention. And not only that, but that it points to a story that we are embedded in that does have a projected future, that is a future that is coming to us, this consummation that we read about throughout the pages of Scripture, but that really comes to its fullness in the book of Revelation. And so it's been exciting for us to be able to talk about neuroscience and allow that very neuroscience, the very creation of God itself, to point back to the story of God. And what we've found is that in so doing, many people have been describing how their lives with Jesus have been revitalized and re-energized because they are finding some language and some ways of understanding what it means, for instance, to have their mind be renewed. What is the value in terms of what actually happens in our brain, for instance, when we enter into the discipline of confession or fasting or solitude, for instance? So there are many ways in which we see once again that God, as in the book of Acts it is written, does not leave himself without a witness. And in this case in particular, that witness being his very creation, that being our minds, it circle back to remind us that the story that God has been up to in Jesus all along really has credibility.
Just a powerful book, and I might just mention, endorsed by Rob Mall, who's been on the program with us as we've talked about his book, What a Body Knows About God, as well as Bentley Kraft, who's with the West Dallas Community School, and many other people have been on this program, endorsed the book, The Soul of Shame, Retelling the Stories We Believe About Ourselves. You know, in Romans, it tells us that there is now no condemnation, but people feel condemned and people feel shame. So just before we take a break, give us a definition, at least a working definition of what you mean by shame.
Well, I think, Kerby, we all kind of have a sense of that. In some respects, you don't have to have a scientific definition to know when you feel ashamed about things.
Sure.
I think what we sometimes miss is that, we can imagine shame pretty easily when it comes to those rather large or even catastrophic events that we've experienced, some deep, humiliating event that we might have come across in our lives or that we're aware of that's happened to someone else. What we are not so aware of is the fact that shame as a neurobiological event, as something that actually happens in our brains as primarily a very primitive emotional state, is something that emerges early in the human experience. Children as early as 15 months of age can have it, can experience it. But it also shows up early and often in the biblical narrative, pointing to the notion that evil wields shame. In my view, I invite the reader to consider that evil wields shame as one of, if not its very most primary weapons in undoing God's kingdom. And so we would say that most of what creates trouble for us is this repeated, multifaceted place of condemnation in our own heads that take place most of the time.
Yes. This
notion that there is therefore no condemnation is a huge theological concept. The challenge that we have is making that a real and experienced phenomenon in day-to-day life as I live and breathe with other people.
Yes. Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll deeply dig into the soul of shame. And a little bit later, perhaps you would like to join the conversation today, as we're privileged to have with us Dr. Curt Thompson, a psychiatrist in private practice in Falls Church, Virginia, and the founder of the Center for Being Known. This is an InterVarsity book. We have information about him and the book on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with him and then with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How can we stop ISIS? That is a question many are asking, so it's worth sharing a plan that makes sense. Former CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin has written in the past about the scourge of ISIS. Today I want to explain his latest plan using military strategy. He is quick to explain that there is no military solution to the problem of radical Islam, but he also adds that it is impossible to talk about ending ISIS without a military component. The major task is figuring out how to implement these ideas. Here are 5 important steps. First, establish clear priorities. Too often the U.S. government has tried to do many things at once, degrading ISIS while also weakening the Assad regime. That weakening one strengthens the other. Therefore, it is time to say that destroying ISIS comes first. Second, we need to provide better arms for those fighting ISIS. This would certainly include providing arms for the Kurds in Syria. They have demonstrated the will and the capability to defeat ISIS. Third, intensify the U.S. response. We should intensify the air campaign and increase the number of U.S. special operators in the theater well beyond the 50 sent by the president. Fourth, we should establish safe enclaves within Syria for fighters and refugees. This could be manned partly by U.S. advisors and also a warning to Assad that violating the space would risk destroying his air force. Fifth, lead in the formation of a substantial multinational force. This force could be capable of destroying ISIS, and this is a significant leadership challenge, but it must be done successfully. ISIS can be defeated militarily, but this must include a coalition of other forces. Ending ISIS requires leadership and a concerted military response. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
This Christmas, bring home and share the gift of War Room on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD, available in stores December 22nd.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Curt Thompson as we talk about his book, The Soul of Shame. And as we get into the book, let's maybe talk about how this has surfaced in your practice. Because some people might say, well, I've heard about shame, but I don't exactly know how it manifests itself. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. And, I think, Kerby, again, to emphasize the notion that, even in the pages of Genesis chapter 3, we get a picture of how evil works. Mm-hmm. Evil has no desire or intention for notoriety per se. Evil's intention is to destroy the creation. Its desire is not for fame. Its desire is for us to be destroyed. And given that, even in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, it doesn't show up trying to have the author doesn't write a lot about the role of the serpent after the conversation with the woman and the man. He just kind of like fades into the woodwork. And in that same way, most of how shame shows up for us in day-to-day activity shows up in the very, very small and subtle and silent activity within our own minds. So, for instance, it's certainly would not be surprising for someone with whom I'm working, say, who's endured a rape, for example, to talk about shame, or someone who's had an affair, or someone who has an alcohol problem. Those things don't surprise us so much. But what does tend to happen more frequently that we are operating very, very unaware of has to do with the myriad of comments, phrases, felt sensations, images, and so forth that are going back and forth in our minds all day, every day, in which in some way, shape, or form, we are taking in the notion that there's something not enough about us. I should have done that. I didn't do that well enough. I should work harder at this. God is not pleased with me at this. Jesus, I'm sure, would be disappointed. And those words, for instance, those are words that are phrases that represent things that often don't come into our mind as words. We just feel the depth of the reality of Jesus would be disappointed. That shows up in the way we image him. That shows up in the way we take in the somewhat condescending glance from our spouse, or the one that we give to our kids, or that we give to our employees, or hear from our employer, and so forth and so on. And so part of what we do is that we really do what we believe Jesus did in his life on earth. When the text in the letter to the Hebrews in the 12th chapter, when we were implored to therefore fix our eyes on Jesus, we are to watch him and do what he did, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. There is a sense in which Jesus did not wait for shame to come to find him. Jesus went looking for it. Jesus went into the desert after his baptism, looking for the devil, not the other way around.
Yes.
He went looking to intentionally address any and all areas where his enemy might be hiding. And so when we notice that shame is afoot, the very act of being aware of it and noticing it actually interrupts its capacity to automatically take us further down that rabbit hole that we often will go. One of the things that we do for patients is we have them do a shame inventory. It's pretty simple. Mm-hmm. We have them take a 3x5 card, and any time in the course of their day that they sense, image, feel, think, or behave out of shame, no matter how small the moment, we simply want them to make a mark on that piece of paper. We don't even need to know why it happened, where it came from, why they did it.
Or what it was, yeah.
We simply want to make sure that they know that it's happened, because the very act of paying attention to it can then help them shift their attention to a different direction, which is around this question of, to what degree do we actually live as if we believe that we are deeply delighted in by the Holy Trinity?
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, maybe talk about, you have this in your second chapter, how shame targets the mind. Obviously, this is not a medical class, but we recognize today that we understand that these sort of recurring feelings of guilt, of shame, of regret, of just almost like it's almost like a physical pain that jumps through your brain. Talk about why that happens, because I think any listener that is relating to this can say, yeah, I know exactly why I have that feeling. I almost jump because it jumps through me, and there's a reason for that in terms of what happens in the brain, isn't there?
That's absolutely true. We all get the sense that if we were to take a moment of shame that feels pretty extreme, for example, we know that if a child does this actually even happens in dogs, we've seen them, that if we feel ashamed, we tend to do certain things physically. We tend to drop our head, we drop our gaze, we turn away from whoever the person is that has said something. We don't like to be seen. But in addition to what we do to turn away from others physically, there are certain functions of the mind that then feel like they are separating. So, for example, when I'm in the middle of feeling deeply ashamed, it's very hard for me to think clearly. It's very hard for me to actually physically move. It's very difficult for me to marshal my emotional state to move out of that place of shame. And in this way, the very act of experiencing shame tends to, what we say, disintegrate multiple functions of the mind. In the mind, we sense things, we image things, we feel things, we think things, we act on things physically. And when we are whole, right, when we are being whole, even as our Father in heaven is also whole, the meaning of that word perfect in the Sermon on the Mount, when we are being whole, all of those different features and functions of the mind are working as a coherent, together unit. What shame does is separates all those from one another. But not only does it separate my thinking from my feeling, and my thinking and feeling from my behavior and from my sensing, so that I operate very, very poorly, but it also therefore separates me from others. I am disconnected not only within my own mind, I am disconnected from other people. And this is the very thing that evil is looking to do, this ultimate sense of separation, this ultimate sense of being apart from, disconnected from, relationally with God, with others, and so forth. The very antithesis of what St. Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 12 when he talks about the body of Christ, this unified whole that though it has many distinct, diversified parts, all in Jesus as our head come together as a unified whole body.
So again, part of what we're going to talk about after the break, I think, is would you talk about this idea of a healing cloud of witnesses? Because again, if you withdraw from other individuals, then in a sense, evil and shame has done its work, right?
That's absolutely right, Kerby. I think that, I had the privilege of being in Israel. I've been invited to come and do some work with a hospital there in Nazareth around some of these issues of neuroscience and spiritual formation. And not that there are no other places in the world like unto it, but surely it is a place where this sense of peoples being separated from one another based on layer upon layer upon layer of woundedness and shame that keeps people separate. There's no place on earth I can imagine that would be any more like unto this, where shame has taken root and where we can't be connected to one another. The very thing that Jesus has come to resolve, this separation between humankind and God, but also the separation that we deeply feel between human beings, but also the separation that I experience within my own mind. And so it is in Jesus and his creation of a healing community that he basically left in charge of the gospel in the power of the Holy Spirit, wherein which we find the healing from shame that we so desperately need.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled The Soul of Shame, Retelling the Stories We Believe About Ourselves. Dr. Curt Thompson with us, and it is published by InterVarsity Press. You can find information about it on our website. Perhaps you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore. If not, we've given a place for you to order it there, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the resources that are also available through Dr. Thompson's Center for Being Known, and that's coming up in just a minute. But before we go to the break, let me again encourage you to take a minute right now to make a gift to Point of View. Your gift to Point of View will change lives, and those lives can help change the nation. And I've told you a few stories, but I thought for a minute I might mention Rodney Hare. He started Liberty Christian School because of what he learned on Point of View about the public school system. And as he was listening, he was beginning to recognize the importance of providing an alternative. Well, this school, Liberty Christian School, has helped form the biblical worldview for tens of thousands of students. And Rodney's life was changed in large part because of people that gave in the past to Point of View. So won't you consider doing the same today? Change a life with your gift to Point of View. The life you change to your gift will help change a nation, and that is certainly the theme. As you go to our website, you'll notice that there's a button that says Changing Lives, Changing the Nation. So please, your generous gift will help us continue these kinds of programs and begin to change the nation. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Point of View is a team, and you play a vital role. Years ago, a 19-year-old started listening to Point of View. It educated her. It inspired her. And the rest of Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann's story is history. We could tell so many stories, people who are changing their community and changing the nation thanks to Point of View. Make your final shot of 2015 count. Invest as generously as you can. Look for the Changing Lives, Changing the Nation banner at pointofview.net. pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
From Provident Films comes War Room. The movie that inspired audiences is coming to DVD and Blu-ray in time for Christmas.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
Prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room on DVD and Blu-ray. Available at Christian retailers December 22nd.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Curt Thompson, and if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, founder of the Center for Being Known, and we have a link to beingknown.com on our website. And of course, the book is called The Soul of Shame. You can find out more about that at that website. We also have a link to it to order it, and you may be even able to find it in your local bookstore, published by InterVarsity Press. Curt, just for a minute, one of our callers offline raised a very good question, because when we talk about shame, we can sometimes recognize we have shame because we were the perpetrator of something or the victim of something. But this particular individual, she was really asking, what about people in the military? You may not have done something wrong or had something done to you, may just observe that, or people in law enforcement that have observed very difficult, evil kinds of things. Now, we oftentimes refer to that as PTSD, but it seems to me that some of the same issues you're talking about how this affects our brain affects them as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize in the book is the nature of how primal the activity of shame is. And when I say primal, I mean not just fundamental to each of our own individuals' neurodevelopment and our neurological experience, but also fundamental to the human experience, in that this is something that has been around for a long, long time in the human experience. Interestingly enough, that you bring up, PTSD, because many cases of PTSD now, as we see, is what we call secondary PTSD. So this is trauma that we experience because we have observed something. So the trauma itself, I may not be the victim of the thing that I've observed, but in some sense, my brain actually is the victim of something by virtue of my witnessing it. And one of the primary elements of this, again, is this sense that the overarching neurobiological shearing effect of an event, such as witnessing a murder or witnessing combat, these kinds of things, do have a way of, in the same way that shame does, tends to disintegrate, tends to disconnect our brain's capacity to work as a functional whole. This is why people, because something can be so painful to witness, we may not be able to incorporate into our memory these different parts of that event, whether what I see versus what I hear versus what I feel versus what I'm thinking, all into a coherent whole. Therefore, we have fragments of each of different parts of this experience that get left out and that show up in the middle of my sleep-in nightmares or show up as a flashback in the middle of the day. This is, in some respects, neurobiologically not unlike what happens with shame. And we would say that toxic relational ruptures, physical or sexual abuse, repeated contempt that is experienced in a marriage or between a parent and a child or between an employer and employee, these kinds of events are experienced by the brain as toxic, traumatic events. In many cases, not even perhaps a large singular event, but multiple, less
like water torture, drip, 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 right?
That's exactly right.
Continuous contemptual comments in a marriage or to parent and child or whatever it might be. Go ahead.
That's correct. And so most of us, and part of the challenge is, of course, is that most of us find ourselves in situations in which the context in which we experience these things is sending another overarching message. So, for instance, if I'm in combat, if I've signed up to be in the military, well, of course I'm going to be seeing these kinds of horrific things. So the context would say to me at one level, one would expect to be able to handle this because this is the job that I've taken. The problem is that my brain's not really prepared for that. Well, one would expect to be able to handle this because what my husband is saying is not that bad. Or my husband behaves this way in my marriage, but out in public and in his role as deacon in the church, he behaves like a prince. And so perhaps it's not really that bad because there's all this other evidence of his good behavior. So we have other constructs, other contexts, other ways in which evil wants to disintegrate our mind that allows shame to do its work of disintegrating us, particularly along this line of accusation and condemnation. So the fact that we have these kinds of events that happen repeatedly in small ways that are hidden from other people who can speak into that are part of what gives shame its power.
Again, I might just mention there's also a Center for Brain Health. Of course, yours is a Center for Being Known. And just, again, to recognize that we're learning a lot more about how the brain interacts. And certainly for a while, let's, if we can, maybe talk about some of the solutions. Certainly we've talked about the problem. One of the remedies you talk about in the book is vulnerability. Another is this idea of a healing cloud of witnesses. What about this issue, first of all, of vulnerability? How does that help this issue of shame?
It's a great question. And once again, we start at the beginning. And in the end of the second chapter of Genesis, we read that the man and the woman were naked and unashamed. One would wonder, why does the author point to this particular reality? And we discover, that in order for us as human beings to be at our creative best, it actually, as it turns out, requires vulnerability. For the man and the woman to be who they were designed to be required that they need each other in order to do this. We like to say that there probably is no more powerful creative event that human beings engage in than having sex and having babies. And this act, or these two acts on the end of a spectrum, require great vulnerability, require nakedness, and it's very messy. Both sides of this is very messy, and it requires vulnerability. I live in a world in which I would like to believe that I could be my most creative on my own. I'd like to know that I can do things perfectly. I don't want to need someone else's help because shame gets too easily activated that way. But as it turns out, we were actually originally made needing each other in order for us to most powerfully, most beautifully create that which we cannot create on our own. Whether we're talking about making babies, or we're talking about making software, or we're talking about making public policy for what we do with the latest terrorists, all of our creative acts are done most powerfully when done vulnerably in the context of others with whom we do it together. This is no different when it comes then to the healing of the shameful experiences that we have. This notion of vulnerability is necessary in order for me to create space to be connected to others, such that, number one, my shame can be healed, and number two, I can be released to now become that creative agent that God originally had in mind when He first made me. And so the thrust of the book ultimately is not just about shame is a bad thing, nobody likes it, here's what you do, you heal it, and now you feel better about yourself. Because that's not God's mission. God doesn't send Jesus to help us feel better about ourselves. God sends Jesus to regenerate a world in order for us to be reborn, to create in this world, to have dominion in this world, as God intended for us to have dominion, as He intended for us to be co-creators with Him. We burn so much unconscious energy just being shame managers, that energy is not available at our disposal to be the creative beings that God wants us to be. And so with the acts of vulnerability in which I essentially entered into relationships of confession, actively telling the truth about my limits, and hearing that truth spoken as well by others who are sharing their vulnerabilities, we together create opportunities to create things that we never would be able to create apart from the Holy Spirit's work in that very space that exists in between us.
Wow. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and get into that in a little more detail. You sort of alluded to that, but you have a section here on the power of healing communities. And even though we've talked a little bit about this idea of vulnerability, we'll come back to the healing cloud of witnesses. And again, that I think maybe sounds familiar. Go back to maybe Hebrews 12. You see a little bit of that, and we'll talk about this and much more as we talk about this book, The Soul of Shame, Retelling the Stories We Believe About Ourselves. It is published by InterVarsity Press. You probably could find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a couple of links that we'll talk about in just a minute, including one to the Center for Being Known. And if you would like to have a conversation or maybe share some of your own struggles with Dr. Curt Thompson, there's a great opportunity for you to do so. And we have that link on the website. And, of course, we have a link if you are interested in the book. You might be able to find it in a local bookstore, but if not, you can click on that. And there's a way in which you can get it in a variety of different formats. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Might get to a phone call in just a minute, but Curt, just before we do so, we have a link to beingknown.com. There is a way in which people can find out more about your previous book, Anatomy of the Soul, and the current book, The Soul of Shame. It's also a place where people can contact you, invite you to speak, find a lot of other resources, even find out more about this idea of rewiring your mind. But talk about what people will find when they land on that website.
Thanks so much for bringing that up, Kerby. When people go to the site, they will see options for inviting me to speak. They will see the options for blog posts. They will also get opportunities for past newsletters where I address some of these items systematically that are covered both in Anatomy of the Soul and in The Soul of Shame. One of the things that's happening currently is that in the last 2 years, it's finally gained traction, but specifically in the last 4 months, we've formed a new nonprofit called the Center for Being Known. And what we're trying to do in that group is to develop curriculum and training events and even retreats that really create space for people to experience this notion of what it means to integrate the power of interpersonal neurobiology and Christian spiritual formation. These trainings and retreats are really designed for anyone, specifically targeting folks that are not just in the mental health field, but leaders in the church, leaders in business, leaders in education, and in the world of art, really creating opportunities for them to see how being open to these things of the mind that we're talking about creates opportunity for God to do the renewing work that He really longs to do, so that He can then, even through those folks, create opportunities for renewing the minds of others who are in their circles of intimacy.
Let's see if we can take a phone call just to use an illustration of how this would work, and we'll go to KCTA in Texas. Esther, thank you for calling today. You're on with Curt Thompson.
Thank you so much for coming on the air today, Mr. Thompson. You made me realize something that I've been dealing with since I was 5 years old. I'm 52 now. And today, a great burden was lifted off my shoulders because I realize now why things happen. And it's not about, please tell me the title of your book again, please.
Oh, The Soul of Shame.
It shouldn't even be called that. It should be called The Oppressor of the Soul, because it's evil, because, of course, the ruler of the world is the devil. And he's oppressing people, making them feel guilty for things they shouldn't, because God says you should just repent, confess, and He will forgive you. Well, I've been holding some, I don't even know if I'm angry. I'm mostly, I guess, ashamed, because I was molested by some relatives when I was a child. And I didn't know if I hated him or anything. I guess I really don't hate him. Like you said, it makes you feel ashamed. You feel at fault. How could somebody be at fault when they just turned 5? But that's what it's about. It forms you, the evil oppressing you and keeping you from forgiving and trying to figure out, what do I do next? What do I do next?
Right.
The first thing we should do is go to God. Say, forgive me for not forgiving. Forgive me for not doing the right things. You opened my mind and my heart today. I'm so grateful to you for you coming on the radio today. You changed my life because of the Holy Spirit talking through you. I'm so grateful to you.
Well, thanks be to God. And I think that, you really bring up a great point, that this notion that we all walk around with this sense of accusation in our head that can emerge from the time that we're little, and then certainly those things become more deeply embedded when we experience traumatic events. And I first want to say that I'm just very sorry for the events that happened to you. That's not the way life should be, but deeply grateful that Jesus has come to tell us the good news that God is with us and God's delight is in us, and that He's come to really model for us what it means to help us practice paying attention to God's delight, which is, I think, a significant part of what we are trying to address when it comes to this question of our great cloud of witnesses.
Let's, if we can, maybe also take one other call just to illustrate the point. Carol, you're on with Dr. Curt Thompson.
Thank you. I didn't hear all of the program, so you may have addressed this already. I work as a social worker, and in my field I work with people that have been victims of sexual abuse and trauma as children and then as elderly. Do you have any suggestions on working with them and helping them to address the issues of shame as a social worker, as a working with clients?
Well, Carol, it's of course, I think when it comes, you're targeting, I think, one of the central and core elements that trauma really activates, and that is this notion of shame. And again, because shame from an experiential standpoint is first and foremost primarily an emotional state. It is primarily a neurobiological and neurophysiological experience that we have. It is not just some cognitive misstep. It's not just a misunderstanding that, 1 + 1 actually equals 2, it doesn't equal 3, and now we'll correct my thinking and now I'll feel better about that. Instead, it is a deeply embodied experience that is related to real events in real time and space that we remember and practice remembering over and over again, and part of what is woven into that is the accusation that comes that often we become partners in that we don't even know that we've partnered in. And so sometimes it's not a simple one-step action that enables us to recover. But I think that one of the things that we do try to address in this book, again, in terms of steps that are helping people, really starts with this question of who is in the community of people that I'm going to be spending time with, that I will be paying attention to my experiences with them that are going to enable me to countermand the shaming experience that is in my memory. Again, back to this question of who our healing shame, that what it means to heal shame through this cloud of witnesses, why that's so crucially important. But part of it also, Carol, involves simply beginning to help people practice paying attention to their shame in ways that they can manage. So often the shame comes and overwhelms us because we're trying to, it's like an entire shower that covers us at once, as opposed to our finding and thinking about, and this is where we need other people to help us do this, thinking about paying attention to it in smaller slices, in ways in which we literally experience what's going on in our body, and then enacting those physical things, those new physical behaviors that can help counteract that, whereby which, by practicing that, we can then begin to change even the nature of what we feel and what we think. But important to realize, again, that this happens in the context of the assistance that we need from other brains, from other people that are in community with us.
Just about out of time, and I did want to mention, just before we run out of time here, that you not only have in the book some great material, but also a discussion guide. But let me also encourage individuals that would like to listen to this again. They can download the podcast, or they can watch it on our YouTube channel. And, of course, they can go to beingknown.com, and you'll be glad to respond to some of the individuals that might have questions or comments, wouldn't you?
Indeed. I think that you can, as I said to people, if you wanted to write everything you wanted to say, it'd be a 500-page book and nobody's going to buy that or read that. And so I think that the comments that we find in the back of the book, the questions, I think, are helpful for us because it's not just a matter of getting more information, it's about becoming more curious and walking into those places of curiosity with other people who can be helpful for us.
That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.